Elena Martinez was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the world was a little brighter. At 23, she had this amazing gift of seeing good in everything and everyone. While other people complained about rainy days, Elena would point out how the rain made the flowers grow. When someone was having a bad day, she'd be the first person to offer a warm smile and ask if they needed anything. Every morning, Elena would wake up with this natural excitement about the day ahead. She worked as a children's librarian in a small coastal town, and honestly, she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The moment she walked into that library, surrounded by colorful picture books and tiny chairs, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The children loved her because she didn't just read stories to them, she became part of the stories. When she read about brave knights, her voice would get strong and bold. When she talked about gentle fairies, she'd whisper like she was sharing the most precious secret. Elena had this routine that made everyone smile. She'd arrive at the library 30 minutes early every day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She'd arrange the books just right, make sure the reading corner was cozy with soft pillows, and sometimes she'd even bring in fresh flowers from her small garden. The other librarians would tease her about going overboard, but Elena would just laugh and say that children deserve beautiful spaces to discover the magic of books. Her kindness wasn't just limited to work. Elena volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday, reading to the dogs because she believed it helped them feel less lonely. She also spent her Sunday afternoons at the senior center, helping elderly people write letters to their families. Her friends often wondered how she had so much energy for everyone else. But Elena never saw it as work. She saw it as just being human. The thing about Elena was that she trusted people completely. When the grocery store clerk gave her too much change, she'd always go back to return it. When someone told her a sob story, she'd believe every word and offered to help however she could. Her parents worried about her sometimes, calling her to trusting. But Elena would just shake her head and say that believing in people brought out their best side. She lived in a small apartment above the town's bakery, and every morning she'd wake up to the smell of fresh bread. Elena had decorated her place with handmade crafts from local artists and photos of all the children she'd helped learn to read. Her neighbors adored her because she was always willing to help. She'd water plants when people went on vacation, bring soup when someone was sick, and she even organized the building's first ever potluck dinner. Elena's love life was pretty much non-existent, and she was okay with that. She believed that love would find her when the time was right, like how butterflies find flowers without anyone forcing them together. Her friends tried to set her up on dates, but Elena would politely decline, saying she was too busy spreading joy to worry about romance. Deep down, she dreamed of meeting someone who would appreciate her gentle heart and share her belief that kindness could change the world. What Elena didn't know was that someone had been noticing her for quite some time. David Chen worked at the auto repair shop across town, and every 6 months when Elena brought her old Honda for service, he'd find himself completely tongue-tied. David was the opposite of Elena in many ways, quiet where she was chatty, careful where she was trusting, and practical where she was dreamy. But something about her genuine kindness made his heart skip beats. David had been working on cars since he was 16, following in his father's footsteps. He was known around town as the honest mechanic, the guy who wouldn't try to sell you parts you didn't need or charge you for work he didn't do. Most customers appreciated his straightforward approach, but Elena was different. She was the only person who ever thanked him for checking her tire pressure, who brought homemade cookies for his waiting room, and who asked about his day like she genuinely cared about the answer. Every time Elena left the shop, David would find himself thinking about her smile for hours. He'd wonder what it would be like to have someone so positive in his life, someone who could find joy in the smallest things. But David was a practical man, and he figured someone like Elena, so full of light and hope, would never be interested in someone like him, with his quiet ways and grease-stained hands. The whole town knew Elena as the girl who believed in fairy tales. She'd organize charity drives that somehow always exceeded their goals, plan community events that brought neighbors together, and she had this way of making everyone feel special. Children would run up to her on the street just to show her their drawings, or tell her about their pet hamster. Adults would find themselves confessing their dreams to her because she listened like every word mattered. Elena's world was built on the foundation that people were fundamentally good. She believed that everyone had a story worth hearing, that every person deserved kindness, and that love, in all its forms, was the answer to most of life's problems. She'd never experienced real heartbreak or betrayal, so this belief felt as natural to her as breathing. Her innocence wasn't childish naivety. It was a conscious choice to see the beauty in a world that often seemed dark to others. As spring turned to summer in her small coastal town, Elena continued her daily routine of spreading joy wherever she went. She had no idea that her pure heart was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined, and that the man who quietly admired her from across town would become the most important person in her life. For now, she was content being the lighthouse of positivity in her community, never knowing that sometimes the brightest lights attract the darkest storms. It was a Thursday evening in late September when Elena's world came crashing down. She had stayed late at the library to prepare for the next day's story time, arranging books about friendship and kindness. The building was quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of waves from the nearby coast. Elena loved these peaceful moments when she could work without interruption. Humming softly to herself as she organized the children's section, she was heading to the storage room to get more construction paper when she heard voices coming from Mrs. Harrison's office. The head librarian had been Elena's mentor for 3 years, the woman who had taught her how to make story time magical and how to connect with shy children. Mrs. Harrison was like the grandmother Elena had never had, always offering warm hugs and wise advice about life and work. Elena was about to knock on the door to say goodnight when she heard something that made her freeze. Mrs. Harrison was on the phone, and her voice sounded different, cold and calculating in a way Elena had never heard before. Through the slightly open door, Elena could see Mrs. Harrison at her computer, clicking through screens that looked like financial records. "Yes, I transferred another $500 this week," Mrs. Harrison was saying into the phone. "The children's program account is plenty. Nobody ever checks these things anyway. These people trust me completely." Elena's heart started beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping she had misunderstood what she was hearing. Maybe Mrs. Harrison was talking about something else. Maybe she was helping someone in need. Elena's mind raced, trying to find any explanation that would make sense. But then Mrs. Harrison continued talking, and Elena's worst fears were confirmed. "I've been doing this for almost 2 years now, small amounts at first, but nobody noticed, so I got bolder. The reading program budget, the field trip money, even the funds for new books, it's all just sitting there. These kids won't miss a few canceled activities." Elena felt like she was going to be sick. The woman she had looked up to, the person who had taught her about nurturing young minds and creating safe spaces for children, was stealing from the very kids they were supposed to help. All those times programs had been canceled due to budget cuts. All those moments when Elena had wondered why they couldn't afford new books or educational trips. It was all because Mrs. Harrison had been taking the money. Elena quietly backed away from the door, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. She couldn't process what she had just heard. This was the woman who had hired her, who had praised her dedication to the children, who had become like family to her. How could someone who spoke so beautifully about helping children be stealing from them? That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Mrs. Harrison was going through some kind of crisis and would return the money. Elena's trusting heart desperately wanted to believe that the woman she admired wasn't capable of such betrayal. For 3 days, Elena watched Mrs. Harrison carefully, looking for any sign that she had been wrong about what she heard. But instead, she noticed things she had never seen before. Mrs. Harrison's expensive new jewelry, her designer handbags, her frequent trips to the city. Elena also started paying attention to the children's program budget, and what she found made her stomach turn. Over the past 2 years, dozens of activities had been canceled. The summer reading program had been cut in half. Field trips to the Science Museum and the zoo had been eliminated. New book purchases had dropped by 70%. Elena calculated that thousands of dollars meant for children's education and enrichment had simply vanished. The hardest part was watching the children's disappointment week after week. 7-year-old Tommy had been asking for months when they would get new adventure books. 9-year-old Lisa had been saving her allowance to help pay for the canceled field trip to the aquarium. These kids trusted the library to provide them with opportunities to learn and grow. And someone they should have been able to trust was stealing those opportunities away. Elena realized she had to make an impossible choice. She could pretend she had never heard that conversation, continue working alongside Mrs. Harrison, and let the stealing continue. Or she could report what she had discovered, knowing it would destroy the career of someone she had once loved like family. The decision became clear when Elena overheard Mrs. Harrison talking to a parent about why the holiday party had been canceled. "I'm sorry, but we just don't have the budget this year," Mrs. Harrison said with a concerned expression. "These are tough times for everyone." Elena watched the parent's face fall as she explained to her disappointed child that there wouldn't be a holiday celebration at the library. That night, Elena made the most difficult decision of her life. She gathered all the evidence she could. Fine, budget reports, canceled program announcements, and detailed notes about what she had overheard. With trembling hands, she wrote a report documenting everything she had discovered. The next morning, she walked into the city offices and filed a formal complaint. The investigation happened quickly. Within a week, Mrs. Harrison was arrested, and the full extent of her theft was revealed. She had stolen over $15,000 from children's programs over 2 years, money that had been donated by families and local businesses specifically to help kids in their community. But Elena's nightmare was just beginning. The tight-knit library community didn't see her as a hero who had protected the children. Instead, they saw her as a traitor who had destroyed the career of a respected community member. Parents who had once praised Elena's dedication now questioned her loyalty. Co-workers who had been friendly became cold and distant. "How could you do this to Mrs. Harrison?" one parent asked Elena angrily. "She's been part of this community for 20 years. There must have been another way to handle this." Elena tried to explain that she had only been thinking about the children, about the money that had been stolen from their programs. But her words fell on deaf ears. People preferred to believe that Elena had misunderstood the situation or that she had acted out of jealousy or ambition. For the first time in her life, Elena experienced the crushing weight of doing the right thing when everyone around her believed it was wrong. She had always believed that good actions would be recognized and appreciated. She had never imagined that protecting children would make her the villain. In other people's stories, the woman who had once seen rainbows in every storm was learning that sometimes the sky stays gray for a very long time. Elena's pure heart had been tested, and while she had chosen correctly, the cost was higher than she had ever imagined. Her faith in people, her belief in the goodness of her community, and her trust in the idea that kindness would always be rewarded had been shattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. 3 months after the incident with Mrs. Harrison, Elena had become a completely different person. The woman who used to greet everyone with a warm smile now kept her eyes down. When walking through town, the librarian who once made story time feel like a magical adventure now read books in a flat, emotionless voice that made even the most exciting tales sound boring. Elena had built invisible walls around herself, and she was determined to keep them strong. Every morning, she would wake up and remind herself that trusting people was dangerous. She had learned the hard way that even the people closest to you could hurt you in ways you never imagined. The pain of Mrs. Harrison's betrayal had cut so Deep that Elena decided the only way to protect herself was to stop caring about anyone or anything. At work, Elena became strictly professional. She arrived exactly on time, did her job without any extra effort, and left the moment her shift ended. The children's section, which had once been decorated with colorful drawings and fresh flowers, now looked plain and uninspiring. Elena removed all the personal touches that had made the library feel special. She told herself that decorating was just a waste of time and energy. The children noticed the change immediately. 8-year-old Amy, who had always been Elena's biggest fan, tried to show her a drawing she had made of her favorite story character. Instead of the excited praise Elena used to give, she simply said, "That's nice, Amy. Please put it on the bulletin board yourself." Amy's face fell, and she quietly walked away, confused about why Miss Elena didn't seem to care anymore. Elena's co-workers were worried about her, but every time someone tried to ask if she was okay, Elena would give them a cold look and change the subject. She had decided that workplace friendships were just another way to get hurt. People were only nice to you when they wanted something, and Elena was tired of being disappointed. The most dramatic change in Elena's life was her relationship with Ryan, a smooth-talking businessman who worked in sales for a medical supply company. Elena had met him at a coffee shop, and unlike the warm, genuine connection she used to seek, she was attracted to Ryan precisely because he seemed emotionally unavailable. He was handsome, successful, and treated relationships like business deals with clear expectations, no messy emotions, and no risk of deep disappointment. Ryan was everything David wasn't. Where David was quiet and thoughtful, Ryan was loud and commanding. Where David fixed things with his hands and took pride in honest work, Ryan made money by convincing people to buy things they didn't need. Where David had been patiently waiting for Elena to notice him, Ryan had approached her confidently and asked her out within 10 minutes of meeting her. Elena told herself that dating Ryan was smart and mature. He didn't expect her to be vulnerable or open about her feelings. He didn't ask about her dreams or her fears. Their conversation stayed on safe topics like movies, restaurants, and current events. Elena convinced herself that this was what adult relationships were supposed to be like: practical, predictable, and free from the messy complications of deep emotional connection. For 6 months, Elena lived this way. She went to work, did her job without passion, came home to her apartment, and spent her evenings watching television or reading alone. She stopped volunteering at the animal shelter because she told herself that helping others was just setting herself up for disappointment. She quit her volunteer work at the senior center because she decided that elderly people were just using her for free labor. Elena's friends and family were concerned about the change in her personality. Her mother would call and ask why Elena sounded so different, why she didn't seem excited about anything anymore. Elena would give short answers and end the conversations quickly. She had decided that even family members couldn't be trusted completely. So why risk getting too close to anyone? The old Elena would have been horrified by the person she had become. She was doing the bare minimum at work, treating children like inconveniences, and dating someone who clearly didn't care about her as a person. But the new Elena told herself that this was wisdom, that she had finally learned how the world really worked. She believed that her previous kindness and trust had been childish mistakes, and that protecting herself emotionally was the only way to survive. Meanwhile, David continued his quiet presence in Elena's life, even though she barely seemed to notice him anymore. When her car broke down during a terrible rainstorm, he still came to help her, arriving soaked to the bone but refusing to accept payment. When Elena caught a bad cold and couldn't drive, David still left groceries on her doorstep with a simple note wishing her a quick recovery. Elena's response to David's continued kindness was to become even more distant. She would thank him politely but coldly, treating his gestures like unwanted charity. She had convinced herself that David's kindness was either fake or came with hidden expectations. In her new worldview, nobody did anything nice without wanting something in return. The most telling moment came when Elena overheard two of her co-workers talking about her in the break room. "I miss the old Elena," one of them said. "She used to make this place feel so warm and welcoming. Now it's like working with a robot." Instead of feeling hurt by their words, Elena felt satisfied. She had successfully protected herself from caring what other people thought. Elena's fortress of emotional protection seemed complete. She had a job that paid the bills, a boyfriend who made no emotional demands, and a life that was completely predictable. She told herself that she was happy, that she had finally learned how to be realistic about human nature. She had traded her previous joy and openness for safety and control. But deep down, in a place Elena tried hard not to acknowledge, she felt empty. The woman who had once found magic in everyday moments now saw only routine and obligation. The person who had once believed that kindness could change the world now believed that kindness was just another word for weakness. Elena had successfully protected her heart, but in doing so, she had also imprisoned the best parts of herself. What Elena didn't realize was that her fortress of solitude was about to be challenged by the one person who had never stopped believing in the goodness she had hidden away. David's patient love was about to become the key that would unlock the prison Elena had built around her heart. The first crack in Elena's carefully built emotional armor came from the most unexpected place. A 5-year-old girl named Sophie who had stopped coming to story time for 3 weeks. Elena had noticed Sophie's absence, but had told herself it wasn't her problem. After all, children came and went from the library all the time. But something about Sophie's empty chair during story time kept bothering Elena in ways she couldn't explain. Sophie had been one of the quietest children in the group, always sitting in the back corner with her worn-out teddy bear. She never raised her hand to answer questions. But Elena had noticed how Sophie's eyes would light up during the stories, especially the ones about brave little girls who overcame big challenges. There was something about Sophie's shy smile that reminded Elena of herself as a child. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Elena was organizing returned books when she saw Sophie standing outside the library in the rain, just staring through the window. The little girl looked so small and lost that Elena felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she had been trying to ignore for months. Before she could stop herself, Elena walked outside with an umbrella. "Sophie, what are you doing out here in the rain?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice neutral and professional. Sophie looked up with tears in her eyes. "My mommy and daddy are fighting again. They said I can't come to story time anymore because they're too busy being mad at each other." The little girl's voice was so small that Elena had to lean down to hear her properly. For the first time in months, Elena felt her heart break for someone else. She looked at this tiny child standing in the rain, caught in the middle of her parents' problems, and all of Elena's protective walls suddenly felt foolish and selfish. This little girl needed help, and Elena was the only one who could provide it. "Would you like to come inside and dry off?" Elena asked gently. "Maybe we could read a story together, just the two of us." Sophie nodded eagerly, and Elena felt something she had forgotten existed, the simple joy of making a child happy. As they sat together in the reading corner, Elena found herself naturally slipping back into her old storytelling voice, making the characters come alive with different voices and expressions. Sophie giggled for the first time in weeks, and Elena realized how much she had missed that sound. Over the next few days, Elena couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. She found herself researching books about helping children cope with difficult family situations. She stayed late at work, not because she had to, but because she wanted to create a special collection of stories that might help Sophie and other children going through tough times at home. The more Elena worked on helping Sophie, the more she realized how much she had been missing. She had spent so many months protecting herself from caring about anyone that she had forgotten how good it felt to actually make a difference in someone's life. Her work with Sophie reminded her of why she had become a librarian in the first place. Not for the salary or the job security, but for the chance to help children discover the magic of learning and growing. But Elena's awakening wasn't complete. until she witnessed something that shattered her illusions about Ryan. They were having dinner at an upscale restaurant when Ryan's phone rang. He answered it right at the table, which Elena had always found rude but had never said anything about. This time, however, she couldn't help but listen to his side of the conversation. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand your concerns about the cost," Ryan was saying in his smooth, professional voice. "But think about your granddaughter's health. Can you really put a price on her well-being?" Elena watched Ryan's face as he spoke, and she saw something that made her stomach turn. His expression was cold and calculating, like he was playing a game rather than talking to a worried grandmother. After he hung up, Elena asked who he had been talking to. Ryan laughed and explained that Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman whose granddaughter had diabetes. He had been trying to sell her an expensive glucose monitoring system that cost 3 times more than the basic model that would work just as well. "The old lady is money," Ryan said casually, cutting into the steak. "Her late husband left her a nice pension. She's just being cheap about her granddaughter's health. I'll convince her to buy the premium package by the end of the week." Elena felt sick. She realized that Ryan wasn't just emotionally unavailable. He was actively cruel. He was taking advantage of a grandmother's love and worried to make money he didn't need. The casual way he talked about manipulating an elderly woman reminded Elena of everything she had once stood against. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mrs. Patterson, probably lying awake worrying about her granddaughter and wondering if she was being a bad grandmother for hesitating to spend money she couldn't afford. Elena also thought about Sophie and how different Ryan's approach to vulnerable people was from her own instinct to protect and help. The next morning, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Mrs. Patterson, introduced herself as Ryan's friend, and gently explained that the basic glucose monitoring system would work just as well for her granddaughter. She even helped Mrs. Patterson find a medical supply company that sold the equipment at a fair price. It was a small act of kindness, but it felt like the first honest thing Elena had done in months. She realized that in trying to protect herself from being hurt, she had also stopped herself from helping others. Worse, she had chosen to be with someone who actively hurt people for personal gain. Meanwhile, David's quiet consistency continued to chip away at Elena's defenses. When her car wouldn't start on a freezing morning, he appeared with jumper cables and a thermos of hot coffee. When the library's front door lock broke, leaving Elena stranded outside with an armload of books, David showed up with his tools and fixed the problem without being asked. What struck Elena most was how David never asked for credit or recognition. He didn't help her because he wanted something in return. He helped because that's who he was. His kindness wasn't strategic or manipulative like Ryan's charm. It was just natural. Like breathing, Elena began to notice other things about David too. She saw how he always took extra time with elderly customers at his shop, patiently explaining what was wrong with their cars and never talking down to them. She noticed how he kept a bowl of dog treats for pets who had to wait in cars, and how he never seemed to get frustrated with difficult customers. The biggest revelation came when Elena discovered that David had been anonymously donating to the children's reading program at the library. For over a year, mysterious donations had been keeping the program alive, allowing them to buy new books and plan special activities. Elena had wondered who the generous donor was, but she never imagined it was the quiet mechanic who fixed her car. When Elena finally worked up the courage to ask David about the donations, he looked embarrassed and tried to change the subject. "It's not a big deal," he said simply. "Kids need books. The library needed help. I had some extra money." But Elena knew it was a big deal. David had been healing the exact wound that had broken her faith in humanity. While she had been building walls to protect herself, David had been quietly fixing the damage that Mrs. Harrison had caused. He had been proving through his actions that good people still existed in the world. For the first time in months, Elena began to question the walls she had built around her heart. Maybe protecting herself from all pain wasn't wisdom. Maybe it was just another form of giving up. Maybe the courage to remain open and caring even after being hurt was actually the strongest thing a person could do. Elena's armor was cracking, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she wanted to repair it. Elena's transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with small changes that only she could notice at first. She began arriving at work 15 minutes early again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to arrange the children's reading corner properly. She started bringing in a few flowers from her garden, telling herself they were just leftovers that would go to waste anyway. The children noticed the changes before anyone else. Sophie, who had become Elena's special project, was the first to comment. "Miss Elena, you sound like yourself again when you read stories," the little girl said one afternoon. Elena didn't know how to respond to that, but something warm stirred in her chest. Elena also began staying after work to help Sophie with her reading. The little girl's parents were so busy fighting that they had stopped helping her with homework. Elena told herself she was just doing her job, but deep down she knew it was more than that. She was rediscovering the joy of watching a child's face light up when they understood something new. The breaking point with Ryan came on a Saturday evening, when they were having dinner at his apartment. Elena had been planning to end their relationship for weeks, but she kept putting it off because confrontation had never been her strong suit. That night, Ryan made the decision easy for her. His phone rang during dinner, and as usual, he answered it without excusing himself. Elena listened as he talked to another elderly customer, using the same manipulative tactics she had witnessed before. This time, he was convincing an old man to buy expensive medical equipment his insurance wouldn't cover. "Trust me, Mr. Johnson," Ryan said with fake sincerity, "you can't put a price on your health. Your family would want you to have the best care possible." Elena watched Ryan's face and saw nothing but cold calculation. He was enjoying the manipulation, treating this vulnerable person like a game to be won. When Ryan hung up, he turned to Elena with a satisfied smile. "That's another $3,000 in commission," he said proudly. "These old people have more money than they know what to do with anyway." Elena felt something break inside her, but this time it wasn't her heart. It was the last chain holding her to a life that felt wrong. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly, standing up from the table. Ryan looked confused. "Can't do what? We haven't even had dessert yet." "I can't be with someone who hurts people for money," Elena said, her voice getting stronger. "I can't pretend that what you do is okay. And I can't keep dating you when everything about this feels wrong." Ryan's response was exactly what Elena expected. He got angry and defensive, telling her she was being dramatic and naive. But his words didn't hurt her the way they might have months earlier. Elena had remembered who she was, and Ryan's opinion no longer mattered to her. Walking home that night, Elena felt lighter than she had in months. She had finally admitted to herself that emotional safety wasn't worth the cost of emotional numbness. She would rather risk being hurt than guarantee being empty. The real test of Elena's transformation came 3 weeks later, during the library's annual fundraiser. Elena had been dreading the event for months because it would require her to be open and vulnerable with the community again. Many of the people who had turned against her during the Mrs. Harrison situation would be there, and Elena wasn't sure she was ready to face their judgment. The night of the fundraiser, Elena stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, trying to work up the courage to go. She had prepared a speech about the importance of children's literacy programs, but she was terrified that people would still see her as the woman who had destroyed Mrs. Harrison's career. When Ellen arrived at the community center, she felt all eyes on her. Some people smiled and greeted her warmly, but others turned away or whispered to their companions. Elena's old instinct was to put up her walls and deliver her speech as quickly as possible. But she forced herself to stay open and genuine. Everything was going smoothly until the microphone failed right in the middle of her speech. Elena stood there holding a dead microphone while 200 people stared at her. In uncomfortable silence, she felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, and for a moment, she considered just walking off the stage. Then, from the back of the room, she saw David quietly making his way toward the stage with a small toolbox in his hand. He didn't make a big show of it or draw attention to himself. He just appeared, like he always did when Elena needed help, and quickly fixed the sound system. As the microphone came back to life, Elena looked out at the crowd and saw something she hadn't expected. People were smiling at her, with genuine warmth. Some were even clapping, not just for David's quick fix, but for Elena herself. She realized that many people in the community had forgiven her long ago, and she had been the one holding onto the past. Elena finished her speech with more confidence than she had felt in months. She talked about the importance of second chances, about how children needed adults who would fight for their education even when it was difficult. She spoke about forgiveness and community, and when she was done, the applause was long and heartfelt. After the event, as people were leaving, Elena finally worked up the courage to approach David directly. He was packing up his tools, getting ready to slip away quietly like he always did. "Thank you," Elena said, and David looked up, surprised that she was talking to him. "It was just a loose wire," he said, looking embarrassed by the attention. "Not just for tonight," Elena continued, "for everything. For the donations to the reading program, for always being there when I needed help, for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." David looked at her for a long moment, and Elena saw something in his eyes she had never noticed before. Not just kindness, but deep, patient love. "I never gave up on you because I could see who you really were, even when you couldn't see it yourself," he said softly. They talked until dawn that night. Sitting on the steps of the community center, Elena told David about her fears, about how Mrs. Harrison's betrayal had made her question everything she believed about people. David shared his own stories of disappointment and hurt, and how he had learned that the courage to keep caring was the strongest thing a person could possess. "I used to think that being pure meant never being hurt," Elena said as the sun began to rise. "But now I think it means choosing to love and trust even after you've been hurt. It means staying soft in a world that tries to make you hard." David smiled and took her hand. "I've been waiting for you to remember that," he said. 6 months later, Elena and David were married in the library, surrounded by all the children whose lives Elena had touched over the years. Sophie was the flower girl, proudly carrying a basket of petals from Elena's garden. The community that had once turned against Elena now celebrated her happiness, understanding that her courage to expose the truth had ultimately protected their children. Elena realized that her journey through darkness had made her stronger and wiser. She was still pure, but it was a different kind of purity now, not the naive innocence of someone who had never been tested, but the conscious choice to remain loving and hopeful despite life's disappointments. As Elena and David exchanged vows, she understood that she had been too pure for a galaxy that tried to harden her heart, but she had chosen the man who helped her remember that the greatest strength comes from the courage to remain tender in a world that often rewards hardness. She had learned that love isn't about avoiding pain, but about finding someone worth feeling vulnerable with, someone who would wait patiently while you found your way back to yourself.